Right, so as you can see by the title of this article, Greta Thunberg has been named Time's 2019 Person of the Year, and I think it's pretty. I don't know, I have really a better word for it than kind of stupid and insane. In that, I mean, it's just a political thing, I guess, is the best way of putting it. In that, what, I don't understand. Like, what has she done? Like, she doesn't do anything. Like, she just goes around lecturing people about climate change, and not only is she wrong about what she's lecturing people on, even if she's right, she's doing it in the most hypocritical and pointless way you can possibly do it. And like I say, there's different aspects to this. Number one, climate change is it's in at least from the research I've done, not really a thing. It's almost entirely not man-made, at least the any changes. And you can look at simple. I mean, there's tons of things. Number one, the climate scientists, they're never right. Their predictions are always wrong. They've been caught. At least some of them have been caught lying about the data or talking about lying about data. They've clearly manipulated data in the past. They intentionally start graphs and charts at points in time to make their whatever point they're trying to get across look better. So they'll deliberately start a graph at the coldest time in the last 100 years. Like that's something they're famous for doing. Or they'll deliberately start a graph of hurricanes or tornadoes at a point when there's record low. So they lie about that kind of stuff. Like I say, too, the whole idea of CO2 being or more CO2 being bad, it doesn't stand up to any rational empirical tests for the simple reason that when you increase CO2, the Earth naturally almost accounts for pretty much all of it on its own, and for the simple reason that during the Cambrian era, CO2 was, I believe, about 17 times higher than what it currently is, and the Earth was actually only 2 degrees warmer. So when you increase CO2, the Earth naturally makes up for pretty much all of it. And even if it is a bad thing, well, melting ice and all that kind of stuff isn't an issue because most of the world's ice is at least Arctic ice is already along the ocean or in the ocean, and if it melts, well, it doesn't matter because it's already in the ocean. If you fill up a glass of water and put some ice in there, and let's say you have it filled right to the top, and you wait for the ice to melt, well, the glass doesn't overflow. So that's just a few things just to kind of go over. I don't want to make this as my best arguments against climate change video. I just wanted to bring up a few things. There's other things like when you look at the record hot temperatures, at least for major American cities, almost all of them happened a long time ago. Like most of them were in like the 20s, 30s, even 1910s. I believe only 3 or 4 of them have happened like within the last 50 years or so, and only one in like the last generation. So the whole idea of CO2 being this big issue is it doesn't stand up to any test, and people will always argue, well, if you increase CO2 it increases temperature. And like I say, the if you do it as a science experiment, yes, that's true, but in the real world there's so many other things that you have to account for that it's I wouldn't say it's 100% not true, but it's about 90% not true. So that's kind of that. And but let's just say that you completely agree with climate change. Let's just assume that it's true. Even if you think that it's true and it's this big issue, all Greta Thunberg hasn't spent 1 minute, at least from what I've heard. I mean, you can fact check me on that, but from what I've seen, I mean, I know she hasn't been to China. I don't think she's been to India, and those countries alone account for over half the world's CO2. Not only that, they're building several coal power plants each a year, and yet the states, their carbon over the last 20 years, or their emissions levels over the last 20 years is pretty steady. It's pretty steady. Even though the population's still going up, it's pretty steady. And yet she spends pretty much all her time lecturing Westerners who are doing more than enough, more than their fair share to, and like I say, let's just assume that climate change is real when I'm trying to make this point. They've spent more than their fair share, reducing emissions levels, and yet they still spend all their time over here lecturing us, like in Canada and the States. I think she's in Europe somewhere now, I think Italy or somewhere. And yet, like, it makes no sense, because if climate change is real, you should be looking at the places that are producing the worst and getting them to change their policies. Because in Canada, like, I mean, I always use this example. CO2, first of all, CO2 is only about a fifth of the Earth's greenhouse gases or atmosphere. So even if you reduce all of it, it's still going to have a 20% difference, or at least that's the man-made part. The man-made part is like extremely low percentage. So you're having less than 10% of 20% is the absolute max you can possibly do, and that's if the entire world goes along with it. Like, Canada is about 1% of the Earth, accounts for about 1% of the Earth's emissions. So even if Canada got rid of all their emissions, which is impossible, let's just say you do it 10 or 20%. Like 10% would be a reasonable amount. I don't know what the Paris target is, but let's just assume that it's 10%, because that's a pretty large number, especially in a country where over 1 million people every 3 years are coming to the country. Like, that's quite a bit of people and carbon emissions and whatnot. So you're reducing it by 10% of 1% of 10% of 20%. Like, do you know how small that number is? Like, it's making no difference. And it makes no sense. And anyone, like, whenever you're debating someone, the easiest way to beat someone or win a debate with someone is to point out logical fallacies or contradictions in their argument. Like, that's the easiest way to do it. If you can do that in a debate with someone, I don't care what the topic is, you win. It doesn't matter political lines, anything, you win. Because what it says is that that person hasn't thought out their argument very well, if at all. And with the climate change people and the climate alarmists, well, if climate change is actually this thing, then you shouldn't care about 1% or less than 1% of the Earth's emissions levels. Like, you shouldn't spend any time whatsoever worried about that. The States is still quite a bit less than India and China, at least from the numbers I've seen. I mean, I know they're less than those two. So if you actually cared about this kind of stuff, you would spend the overwhelming majority of your time focused on India and China. If you're not doing that, then your argument makes no sense, because you don't actually care. If you actually cared, you'd spend all your time, or pretty much all your time, in India and China. But they don't do that, and by default, if you actually cared about climate change and it was actually a thing, well, you'd spend pretty much all your time in India and China. So, like I say, I don't want to talk too much about this kind of stuff, but I don't. Number one, like Greta Thunberg she's just a lackey for people that are higher above her. Like, she's clearly just being used, and like, I don't want to be too hard on her individually, but like I say, she's clearly just being used, and she, like a lot of these other climate change people, have came out recently and said, which is just more argument or just more evidence against what they're proving that what they're saying is BS, but about how climate change we have to worry a lot more about the political realm of it, other words referring to socialism. And that, like I say, that if you actually cared about the environment, you wouldn't care about the political aspects of it. Like, and that's the thing too, is that the one of the architects of the Green New Deal said that the Green New Deal is more about socialism than it is about helping the environment. And that's the thing, is that you have all these people who have this extreme skepticism that these people with their climate change goals and all this kind of stuff, carbon taxes, all this kind of stuff, is that anyone in the right mind should have an extreme skepticism that what they really want is to claim that they care about the environment, pretend they care about the environment, just to get their political goals put in. And that's exactly what's happening in Canada, is that the carbon tax, without a doubt, beyond a shadow of a doubt, all the evidence, even the BC government's own numbers shows that the BC carbon tax has reduced their emissions by 0.5%. And like I say, 0.5% would be the most generous number you can point towards. Now, are you honestly willing to tell me that, hundreds, if not thousands of dollars out of The average person, average family's pocket is worth a 0.5% reduction. Like, are you joking? So, I mean, I don't know what more evidence you could possibly point to that shows that these climate alarmists, their real goal is about socialism, is about more government power, and their arguments make no sense. Like, even like, first of all, like, it's strongly, climate change is very, very, very debatable to begin with. I don't think that it's a thing. I think that it's 99% overblown, that it's not an issue whatsoever. But even like I say, to sum it up, even if it is an issue, they shouldn't spend 1 minute lecturing Canada and to a lesser degree the States about their carbon emissions. They should be spending pretty much all their time in India and China. And since they're not doing that, it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that they don't actually care. They pretend to care to get their political goals achieved. And like I say, Greta Thunberg's parents have been shown to be clearly hardcore leftists, I mean borderline communists. And like I say, like if you actually care about this kind of stuff, you'd set your politics aside and you'd figure out the best actual way of doing it. And carbon taxes and socialism isn't that. So I'm gonna leave it there. If you like the video, make sure to hit that like and subscribe and stay tuned for more.